I grew up in Colorado, and in elementary school, middle school, high school, I never heard of this at all. So in the 80s and the 90s, this was a dangerous topic in a lot of ways, and people did not like to talk about it.
Howard Zinn talks about Ludlow. He almost writes about it as being the moment when he has this realization that there's a secret history that he doesn't know, but that he needs to know. That this was this dramatic, important, really fiery incident in American history. And here he is, someone studying history, and he's never heard of it. It's not in the textbooks. How is this possible?
Το Λάντλοου ξεχωρίζει μέσα στην ιστορία του αμερικανικού εργατικού κινήματος γιατί αποτελεί την κορύφωση της εποχής βιομηχανικής βίας. Είναι μια βία απεργία, βία από το ξεκίνημά της, παρατεταμένη, σε ένα απομακρυσμένο σημείο, μακριά από τα αστικά κέντρα όπου υπάρχει μια άλλου τύπου πολιτική και κοινωνική ζήμωση και στην οποία αυτή τη σύγκρουση στο Λάντλοου πρωταγωνιστούν εργάτες, μετανάστες εργάτες οι οποίοι μέχρι χθες θεωρούνταν ανοργάνωτοι και μακριά από κάθε δυνατότητα πολιτικής και κοινωνικής διεκδίκησης.
Even if you're a very conservative business owner today, I feel like you understand why these workers stood up against this tyranny and why they went on strike and why there were so many people who came out in support of it.
So it's an amazing, tragic story. And by inventing my version of Louis, I can write about my misgivings about America.
And then when I started reading about Lewis, Tekas, I said, that's what the song is about. That is not a fictional fairy tale.
And I think that's, again, part of the history that we like to remember and the history that's important, the history that too often gets ignored, until suddenly you can't ignore it anymore. The miners in Colorado, this was always true of American mining, it's very heavily immigrant. It was, from Cornish and Welsh and English in the early days. But then when we get to the new century, in the early 20th century, again in West Virginia and Colorado, for example, heavily Italian, Slavic, Greek, African American, Appalachian in West Virginia, some mountain people in Colorado. But the numbers in Colorado in this strike, there are estimates that something like 70% of the miners were immigrant.
There's an American myth that all of these immigrants that came to the United States were coming for freedom. Well, possibly the Jewish immigrants who were fleeing the pogroms. Certainly many of them came to the United States for freedom, but most of the immigrants, the Greeks, the Italians, the Serbs, the Chinese, the Japanese, they came to make money.
My grandparents came from Italy in 1909. They had looked in other countries for work, but the worldwide economic situation was so desperate that they traveled and searched before they found work in the mine. My grandfather would take anything by that time.
Between 1891 and 1910, 183,000 Greeks came to the United States. Many of them came by paying a padrone, someone who said that they would find them work in the United States and would advance them the money for their steamship tickets, which they would have to pay off once they got to the United States. So before they even left Greece, they were already locked into a kind of economic system that was oppressive. And some of them working for padrones, shoeshine boys especially, were virtually held in slavery.
My great-grandfather Ambrosio grew up in a little town called Castro de Volci, and he and his younger brother Giovanni came to New York in, I think, 1898, and they traveled back to Italy. Both of them got married, and great-grandpa returned to the United States in 1913, made his way to southern Colorado to get involved in the coal mining, which they were told was the greatest industry and had endless possibilities for an immigrant.
Τα έργα κατασκευής του σιδηροδρόμου προς τη Δύση και τα ορυχεία στις μεσοδυτικές και δυτικές πολιτείες προσελκύουν χιλιάδες ανθρώπους οι οποίοι φτάνουν στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες γνωρίζοντας ότι θα εργαστούν εκεί. Γνωρίζουν ότι κάποιος πράκτορας εργασίας τους περιμένει για να τους πάρει στη Νέα Υόρκη και να τους βάλει μέσα σε ένα τρένο το οποίο θα τους οδηγήσει σε αυτά τα μικρά παραπήγματα στη μέση του πουθενά πρακτικά, όπου θα δουλέψουν για μήνες ή για χρόνια, αν είναι αρκετά τυχεροί και δεν έχουν στο μεταξύ τραυματιστεί ή σκοτωθεί μέσα στα χιλιάδες και πολύ πυκνά εργατικά ατυχήματα.
The labor agents, by and large, were not a very honest or very patriotic group of men. Often they'd give a man, and this happened to my grandfather in Colorado, they'd write a slip of paper. You report to the foreman of this railroad line in this part of Colorado. You give the labor agent your last dollar. You'd jump on a boxcar, go into the middle of Colorado. We have no job for you. And there you were with no money, not knowing really where you were, no work. And the labor agents, if they got you a job and kept you, you had to pay them a fee to keep your job, or they would have you fired.
Immigration and people coming from Italy, a lot of those people who ended up mining and the families who came, most of them had been farmers. And it's interesting to analyze the job they took here. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't understand the economic system. They were thrust into it and sort of had to figure it out.
It was a wrenching experience. They were leaving their homeland. They were leaving everything they knew. They were leaving their language. It's not in our history book, largely the history of immigrant workers in this country. The people who built the country are, by and large, unsung.
On the one hand, these were jobs that were quite easy to get. So, this is one reason why there were so many immigrants and immigrants of so many nationalities in the Southern Colorado coal mines. You could show up in Southern Colorado really just with a strong back and a will to work, and you could get a job in the coal mines. But on the other hand, doing well as a coal miner and staying alive as a coal miner, both of those things were actually extremely difficult and took a great deal of skill.
The lives of coal miners, and not just the miners, their families, their strong-willed wives and their daughters and their young sons in these coal camps was very hard. And I think that word can capture so many different emotions and experiences. The women had to do everything around the household. The men had to work all day in these mines. And one of the huge reasons why there was discontent and a strike eventually happened was because of company control. And these large companies like the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company that controlled Southern Colorado, they would implement company towns that had company doctors and a company school for children and a company general store for the wives to shop for goods. And these places were so isolated, families had nothing but what was available at these company towns.
The company sets up everything. If there's housing for the workers, the company makes the housing. If the workers need to have a saloon, the company owns the saloon. If the workers need a store, the company owns the store. Of course, they were making money off of many of these things.
And then there was a problem with the way the miners were paid. It was not U.S. currency. It was called script.
If a miner was only paid company scrip, he could only spend it in the company store. He had to buy his own boots. He had to buy his shovel, his pick, his helmet, his lantern, to go work in the mines. He had to pay the company price to go do that. And the company cheated him. He couldn't go buy it in another man's store because he didn't have money to buy it in another man's store. This was illegal in the state of Colorado, but nobody enforced the law in Southern Colorado. The company was the law. Whoever had the most guns, they were the law.
They had endless amounts of dangers and unsafety regulations that weren't checked or inspected. And if a miner died, there was an accident or a cave-in, it was always said the miner died of his own negligence. It wasn't the fault of the company for not having safety measures. It was his fault for not paying attention.
I think that in a lot of ways, actually, the owners wanted the best of both worlds. They wanted the power of slaveholders without the responsibility. There's a very powerful way in which the owners were trying to achieve some kind of total command over their workers, but they also wanted to do it on the cheap. And so you see this in accidents when coal mines would explode. You'd see this in the smaller accidents when miners would lose arms and no longer be able to work, and the companies would just sort of throw them out. They were done. And the company sort of severed that responsibility. And so this is sort of this era in U.S. history where corporations are trying to sort of maximize their control over the labor force, but they realize that there's actually benefits to doing that in a free labor system where the rule of contract supposedly prevails, because then they are actually less responsible. They have few obligations to their workers.
A mine blows up and the boss says the first thing, how many mules did it kill? Because a mule you had to buy, right? It was like a piece of equipment. But the men who might be killed next to the mule, they replaced themselves. They were eager. They needed the money. They'd come down. You didn't have to buy a man. They'd come of their own accord.
Πολύ συχνά ένα τυχαίο γεγονός, μια αδικία σε κάποιον πατριώτη, συμπατριώτη, ένας τραυματισμός ο οποίος δεν αντιμετωπίζεται από την εργοδοσία με τον πρέποντα τρόπο, οδηγεί σε βία ξεσπάσματα, σε μια βία εκδίπλωση της εργατικής διαμαρτυρίας που μετασχηματίζεται στην πορεία σε αυτό που εμείς ξέρουμε ως απεργία.
My grandfather actually told me when he was about, I think, 15 years old, he saw for the first time a miner die from an accident. And he told me once, we would have grandfather story time when he got older. And he told me this story when he was 15, that he saw this miner die in a cave-in. They removed his body. The mine operator was informed of the accident. They put his body in a coal cart in the front of the mine and left him there all day. And the mine operator told all the miners to get back to work. And what my grandfather said really hit him hard in his heart. No one told this dead miner's wife what had happened until the end of the workday, because the CF&I did not want to lose any income by halting the mine operation that day. Immigrants that came from Southern and Eastern Europe, a lot of English-speaking immigrants and white Americans said they were dark, dirty, and inferior. And a lot of that had to do with their physical appearance, with dark eyes, dark hair, dark skin, and the fact they couldn't speak English. These people cast them in an inferior position.
There was a lot of racism. There still is. But America had been involved in wars in Mexico and in the Philippine Islands. And there were a lot of Americans who did not like dark-skinned people, even if they were dark-skinned people from places like Italy or Mexico. And there were signs in train stations in towns like Pueblo that would say, "This waiting room for Americans only. No Mexicans, Italians, Greeks," etc., etc. So you see the kind of scene that would greet a new immigrant coming to America. You see how much outsiders they felt and how ostracized they felt from the culture at large.
It's really interesting, the language they used to portray Greeks was actually very similar to the language that was used at the time to portray American Indians. So there was this language of savagery, that the Greeks were savage, they were bloodthirsty, they were primitive, they were driven entirely by emotion, they were hyper-masculinized. They viewed these men as fighters, as thugs, and really as kind of scum. It was really in a lot of ways a racialized depiction of the Greeks.
The Ku Klux Klan, which of course was started after the Civil War to try and keep blacks in place, became very active after World War I and again. And their attitudes were that not only were blacks no good, but neither were Catholics, neither were Greeks, neither were Italians.
Union was not just a word that they used to show that some miners were going to try to act together. It meant that they were bonded, bonded in their blood marrow, bonded in their blood. They would risk their lives for each other. They were completely committed.
In the corporate world, unions weren't necessarily recognized. And the reason why it's sort of a gray area is because unions weren't necessarily legal, but they weren't illegal at the same time. So it was a struggle from that aspect just to get your company that you worked for to recognize your right to use a union, to help you get safety measures and any other rights that you were striving for.
Any immigrant could become a member of the United Mine Workers. And they did this for an important reason. There was a lot of anti-immigrant feeling in the United States at that time, a lot of anti-black feeling, as you know. But the United Mine Workers realized that if you exclude one group because they speak a different language or they have a different color. From work in the mines, you've created automatically a huge pool of scab laborers, people who will break your strikes. If blacks are not in your unions, the mine owners will simply say, well, we know where we can get miners if you guys want to go on strike. If Italians are not in your unions, I don't care about you Welshmen, you Cornishmen, you Scotsmen. We'll go get the Italians. We'll go get the Poles. We'll get the Russians. So it was very important to open up the union to all workers.
John Lawson was very much the organizer of the union. He's seen in history as a representative. He's been labeled a lawyer as well for the United Mine Workers in working with these striking miners. And sort of on his side, you've got this great leader named Louis Teikas, or as I've seen his name, Elias Anastasios Spandidakis. And he was a Greek who came to Colorado with the mining industry. And his role was absolutely beautiful in the story because not only did he support union activity and work alongside Lawson in helping get these demands met during the strike, but he was an immigrant. He was just like 90% of those striking miners. He fit in with them. He was their brother. He spoke for them because he understood what they were going through.
We have this wonderful photograph of Louis Teikas, Elias Anastasios Spandidakis, just before he left for the United States in 1906. Teikas was born March 13th, 1880, in a little village of Lutra in Crete, near Rethymnon. And this photograph is very significant if you look at it very carefully. You can see what Teikas really brought with him to the United States. He's wearing, the traditional Cretan vrakis, and the vest, and the little turban with a tassel. In his belt is a pistol. But if you look closely, it's a flintlock pistol. This is a pistol of the 18th century. And here he is at the beginning of the 19th century, coming to engage in an industrial war with a flintlock pistol. What did Teeka know about the industrial world?
Οι Έλληνες μετανάστες όταν φτάνουν στο Ellis Island καταγράφονται από τις Αμερικανικές μεταναστευτικές υπηρεσίες. Και μέσα σε αυτή την καταγραφή, μία από τις βασικές ερωτήσεις είναι πού σκοπεύετε να πάτε, ποιος είναι ο σύνδεσμός σας, ποιος είναι ο άνθρωπος που σας περιμένει στις ΗΠΑ. Και εκεί βλέπει κανείς μέσα από τις απαντήσεις μια εντυπωσιακή γεωγραφική διασπορά. Δηλαδή, οι άνθρωποι φτάνουν τώρα από την Πελοπόννησο στο Ellis Island και δηλώνουν ως τελικό προορισμό ένα μικρό απόμερο σημείο μέσα στο Κολοράντο ή στο Ντένβερ ή σε όλες αυτές τις βιομηχανικές πολιτείες, τις οποίες ποτέ δεν γνωρίζανε, αλλά κάποιος τους έχει πει ότι εκεί κάποιος θα τους περιμένει, ένας συγχωρογεννός πολύ συχνά ή κάποιος από τους πράκτορες εργασίας που δραστηριοποιούνται στην Ελλάδα. Η ιστορία του Teeka και η άφιξη του Teeka στις ΗΠΑ εγγράφεται σε αυτό το γενικό παράδειγμα. Είναι ένας άνθρωπος ο οποίος ξέρει με έναν τρόπο ότι όταν φτάσει θα κατεβεί στη Νέα Υόρκη και σιγά σιγά θα πορευτεί μέσα στο βάθος αυτής της αχανούς αμερικανικής υπήρου.
Louis Teikas had a little coffee house in Denver, Colorado, 1746 Market Street. This is really where we first see what he's doing, how he's making a living. People remembered that coffee house that I talked to. Oh, you'd go in there, you'd play some cards, you'd have a little ice cream, you'd have soda pop. Denver was dry in those days, and so if you had anything else, it was hidden behind the counter. But Teeka was a cafegius. And I think it's really important to imagine why the Kafedis was so important, because this was the clubhouse of the Greeks. This is where letters would be sent. This is where someone like Louis Teikas, who maybe caught on a little quicker, maybe learned English a little faster, maybe had more understanding of American laws, would go to help you negotiate your life in the United States.
People would go to Lewis for all kinds of things. The immigrant Greeks, for example, would ask him to translate something from Greek to English or from English to Greek. People would go to him and ask him for help with every kind of everyday problem, and Lewis always had time for that.
One of the old-timers I interviewed, actually Louis Teikas wrote his love letters. He had a little love flirtation with an American waitress in the restaurant that he worked in. And so he would tell Teikas what to write to this young woman, and Louis would write it down. And then the letters would come back and he'd translate them. But more important were reading the letters from home, or maybe getting you out of trouble. Now, the Greeks in those days, they didn't understand some of these American laws. Who are these people that say you can't play cards on Sunday, or can't have a little drink of wine, when you wanted it? Or what business is it of theirs if two men get in a fight, in the Cafaneo? Suddenly the police have to come? So Louis was always trying to make things a little smoother for the Greeks. And at this point, his life changes radically, and we don't know exactly how this happened. But there was, in 1912, a coal mine strike going on in northern Colorado. In these mines that were on strike, they find a bunch of Greeks who are willing to go down into the mines and work. But they were kept in virtual slavery in those mines. They couldn't leave, they couldn't get out. Nobody knew what to do. Now, was Louis Teikas looking for an opportunity to make a little money and went up and became a scab? That may be true. Or did somehow he get a message from these Greeks? Louis, we don't know what to do. We're kept here like slaves. They're not paying us. How do we come and help us? At any rate, we find Louis Teikas up in those mines, working underground, and in a very few days, he leads all of the Greek miners out of the mine and into the offices of the United Mine Workers Association, and they all become union men. And Louis Teikas becomes a translator for the Greeks and a union organizer.
When he arrived in southern Colorado, he was a huge voice to be reckoned with on the side of the union, advocating for these changes.
Louis Teikas, appeared to have quite broad influence in the Ludlow tent colony. And, this was an incredibly diverse set of people. You had, in the order of 1,200 people living in the tent colony, drawn from more than a dozen nationalities. And it seems like, Louis was an important, it was important to kind of the social cohesion of the colony.
Ο Λούης Τίκας, και θα πρέπει να σκεφτούν τους αντίστοιχους Τίκες μέσα στις υπόλοιπες κοινότητες, είναι αυτό ακριβώς η προσωπικότητα η οποία αναδεικνύεται μέσα από τη μεταναστευτική διαμαρτυρία. Και αν δει κανείς στο Λάντλοου ή και σε άλλες περιπτώσεις, το μοντέλο οργάνωσης της απεργίας είναι μέσα από τη δημιουργία μιας πολυεθνοτικής επιτροπής, στην οποία εκπροσωπούνται οι διαφορετικές κοινότητες των μεταναστών και στις οποίες θα χρειαστεί ένας εκπρόσωπος για να μεταφέρει τις αποφάσεις, για να υπάρχει μια διαρκής επικοινωνία μεταξύ των απεργών πλέον και του συντονιστικού τους οργάνου.
The 7 demands that were called by Southern Colorado, the first was especially important. It was for the CF&I to recognize the right of the miner to use a union, so the recognition of the United Mine Workers. The second right was they wanted to have appropriate wages implemented depending on a miner's job. If their job was something, for an example, just regular coal miner, a pick miner, you would have someone else who would be in charge of taking the coal in and out of the mine with the mules. Then you would have someone, they nicknamed them squib firers. And the squib is the little fuse at the end of the dynamite. So they tried to implement these new policies. If you have a more dangerous job, you should be paid more for it. So that was one of their demands. The third was actually a violation that the CF&I had. They were not enforcing the 8-hour workday. Miners were working up to 14 hours a day. They wanted the 8 hours enforced. They also wanted to be able to have their own check weighman, which was the gentleman who would actually weigh the coal that determined their paycheck. And more often than not, this check weighman was not elected by the miners, and he would not necessarily be very ethical with his weigh-ins. They also had the issues of that company and script tyranny. They wanted the end of that. They wanted to be able to shop wherever they wanted. There was also an issue called dead work, which was clearing the actual mine shaft, setting it up, clearing everything out after an explosion to build a shaft, bringing in timbers. Miners weren't paid. And they had to do these things for maybe days on end just to clear a mine. The last demand, which was extremely important, and it kind of held a pivotal role in the Great Strike, the miners wanted the end of the CF&I's use of armed guards.
So they wanted these guards, these toughs with their guns, these swaggering bullies. They wanted them out of their lives. And finally, of course, they wanted recognition of the union.
The union, the United Mine Workers, wanted to gain a foothold in southern Colorado. So they were willing to fight for it. And they were willing to organize. They had tried to strike around 1903, 1905, and that strike had failed. This was their big new effort. And the great man John Lawson was commanding the strike. And Mother Jones was riding the train down to Trinidad to rile them up, say, fight for your rights, boys, you know. And she was a strong, tough Irish granny, and she would shame the men into going, you know, to fight for their own rights. So the union was able to, at this point, to organize and get enough people to go out on strike. And something like 11,000, 12,000 people went out on strike in September 1913. 1,200 at the Ludlow camp alone, but there were many camps in southern Colorado.
Under all of this, they wanted to be treated as full human beings, you know? If you think of all of these demands, what does it mean? It means that you're a human being, that you have a right to this.
Η ευρύτερη διεκδίκηση στο Κολοράντο αλλά και σε όλα τα εργοτάξια εκείνης της περίοδου δεν είναι απλώς το ημερομίσθιο και η κατοχύρωση των δικαιωμάτων, είναι η κατοχύρωση της θέσης των μεταναστών μέσα στην Αμερικανική κοινωνία. Είναι μια δυναμική διεκδίκηση για κοινωνική και πολιτική ισότητα.
These demands were ushered in on September 23rd, 1913 by a representative called John Lawson from the United Mine Workers. And immediately, once he listed his demands for the miners, they were rejected. And a strike was called that day.
So September 23rd, 1913, the strike began. The workers streamed out of the company houses. They were going to be evicted from the houses anyway. And the union had prepared for them tent colonies at the bases of the mines. The mines are all in canyons, you see. And in the prairie underneath the canyons, this is where the union set up a number of tent colonies. Why did they set them up there? They had to house people. They had to keep them going through the winter. They didn't know how long the strike would end. So they brought tents in. Some of them came from West Virginia, where there had just been a terrible coal mine strike. and they built platforms and put the tents on. They were there strategically placed to kind of guard the entrances to the mine so they could keep the scabs from coming up there. Because, of course, the miners were very interested in breaking the strike and keeping those mines open.
The history books call them strike breakers. Of course, my personal interest with my family going through these things, they're scabs. They're the ones who cross the picket line. But I have sympathy for these scabs. If you analyze Southern Colorado and the mining industry in general, immigrants were coming to fill these positions. They were lured in from the old country by a lot of corporations because they were an easy target to fill these jobs and to be paid poorly. And I feel like when strikes were called, like the Great Strike in 1913, anyone who filled the jobs of these strikers were probably the same immigrants who were being lured in by the corporations for these jobs that they were told were marvelous and a huge opportunity.
You'd have, a group of Greek men from the same village walking through the streets of Chicago, needing work, showing up at an employment agency. That employment agency would have been contacted by Colorado Fuel and Iron, and next thing you know, these guys are on a train with, all the shades pulled down. They have no idea where they're going. And they get off the train and, they feel the train being pelted by, rotten tomatoes and so forth outside the Ludlow tent colony. And so they might be sort of, dumped in Colorado to deal with the consequences.
There's a story I just learned in Colorado about Louis Tekas jumping on a train coming in to the mining area with a bunch of Greeks on it. He jumped onto the train. He came to them and he says, "What are you Greeks doing here? You're trying to break the strike of fellow Greeks. You're trying to take the bread out of your mouth. Get off of this train right now. You should be ashamed of that. And if you don't get off, we'll kill you." And so he encouraged these Greeks to get off of the train, and some of them became union members. But that was their idea, to picket, to keep scabs from getting up to the mines, to try and turn them around. So the biggest tent colony was at Ludlow. And there are about 200 tents in the Ludlow plain. As many as 1,000 people were there. 500 men, 300, 400 women, and the rest children.
The entire time the strike went on and up to the massacre, women were a huge presence in Southern Colorado. And it was these women, the wives and their children, who were on the picket lines, who were the ones having rallies and protests from Commercial Street in Trinidad to the outskirts of Ludlow, all the way up to Denver. These rallies and protests were filled with these women. And it was a brand new time for women to expose their voice, trying to campaign for something that not only would benefit their own rights, but the rights of someone else who was viewed in that inferior way. And my opinion as a woman, I don't think there could have been success without those women on the picket lines.
You got $3 a week strike benefits plus 50 cents for each child. That's not very much, even in those days, to feed yourself, to feed a family. And this is why the women were so important to the strike, because the relationship of men and women changes in the strike. And you can see this in any strike that you look at. You see that suddenly the women become profoundly important. Now, why is that? The men aren't working, right? The men are picketing. The men are trying to keep scabs from getting off the train. The men are often arrested and beaten up. When they can't picket, who pickets? It's the women. Most important is now the economics of the strike, because it's up to the women to keep a family together during that strike, to figure out, how are we going to feed these children? How are we going to get close? How are we going to mend and patch? How are we going to keep them going? Because a strike is made by making it economically impossible for the mines to keep going as they were. It's going to cost these mine owners money. And so you have to wait them out. A strike is about duration. It's a war of attrition against the mine owners. And it's the women who are at the heart of keeping the family fed, keeping their husbands' spirits up, keeping the kids fed, getting the kids to go to school. If once the women say, we can't do this anymore, George, we can't do this, then the strike is lost.
The women held the union together. And what better example than Mother Jones?
People don't know her today. There's a magazine named in her honor, but most people don't even know who she was. She was a labor leader, a labor organizer. She was actually originally, her family were famine immigrants from Ireland, came over in the mid-19th century. She went to Michigan and taught school. She went to Chicago for a little while and ended up married in Memphis, Tennessee, on the eve of the Civil War in 1860, married to a man named George Jones, an iron molder, a union man, back when there were not many unions in America. And Mary Harris was her maiden name. She became Mary Jones. And Mary Jones describes in her autobiography, which she wrote in 1925, describes how one by one all 4 children and her husband died in this epidemic, this yellow fever epidemic in 1867. And we don't know much about her after that for decades. We know that sometime when she's around 60 years old or so, she's clearly involved with the labor movement, especially with the United Mine Workers in eastern Pennsylvania. She's been involved in Coxey's Army, a famous labor action in America for jobs. And people are calling her Mary Jones, calling her Mother Jones. And she insists on being called Mother Jones. She's no longer Mary Harris or Mary Jones. Now she's Mother Jones. She insists on the name, and she insists on this new persona that she creates. The antique black dresses, Victorian dresses, the hellfire speeches. This character emerges right around the turn of the century.
She knew very well what she looked like, as all actresses do. This little old lady with gray hair and, a black dress. And under that little old lady was a woman who was on fire.
She's there in great mine strikes, working for the United Mine Workers, going across the country. She's everywhere. And not just organizing miners. She organizes seamstresses. She organizes brewery workers. She organizes across many trades, but especially miners.
She came to Colorado, and I'll tell you something. Now, the union was not particularly happy to have her there a lot of the time because a strike is not just about powerful words that stir people up, but it's also about planning, about organization, and it's about endurance. And sometimes Mother Jones was a little too fiery for the union. I've heard that from Mary Thomas, one of the women at the strike, that Lee really liked her and was very impressed. And he called her mother too, Mary said. So you can imagine that these were two people that kind of instantly understood each other because, of course, Louis Tekas as a Cretan was something of an actor too, right?
I feel like the early 20th century, there were 2 simultaneous movements happening. The first, you have the labor movement, changes in the industry, what the corporate world had labeled unskilled workers, which were coal miners, no brains and a strong back. That was starting to change. There were new rights that were being seen. There were unions coming in. And at the same time, you have the women's movement, which is going on, striving for very similar things in terms of equality. It was almost like the unskilled worker was inferior in the same way that women were inferior at the time.
Women now get a voice because they're needed. They come into the union meeting and they speak and they have their opinions. And you can imagine what that would have been for a woman from southern Italy, right? Where this is men's business. You keep out of it. But now they need the women to help organize, to keep the men going, to keep the other women organized, to keep the food coming. And so the women have opinions. You're not going to learn about democracy in the closed camps of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company with their guards and their thugs, where the company controls anything. If you learn about democracy, it's going to be in the Union Hall. Unions had an incredibly important role in democratizing new immigrants. The mine owners employed mine guards to harass the strikers and their families, to make them live in fear. One of the things that they did is they went to the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, owned by the Rockefeller interests in Pueblo, and they took an old touring car and they put sheet metal around it. And they made an armored car, and the miners called it the Death Special. The front of that armored car, they had a big spotlight. In the back, they had a machine gun. They would drive through these tent colonies at night, shining that spotlight through the walls of those thin tents. And you realized that at the other end of that car was a machine gun. How is a thin wall of a tent going to keep machine gun bullets from coming through? Constantly, they were harassing the miners.
The CF and I were very prone to using a group called the Baldwin Felts Detectives. And they were nothing more than vigilante hired thugs. And they would come in and violence would often erupt between strikers and new workers that these thugs were sort of trying to protect.
Now, the National Guard was called out by the governor of the state, presumably to keep the peace between the strikers and the guards that the mine owners had hired. But in fact, it became a place where mine guards could find employment. And so the National Guard became a way of having the citizens of Colorado fund the harassment of the striking miners. They were not neutral.
There were very, very bad guys in the National Guard, but there were also some people who were not so bad. So I'll tell you how it worked a little bit. In October 1913, there was a big shootout that started in Walsenburg and made its way down to Ludlow, and many people were killed. The governor of the state of Colorado, as has happened many times since, as happened in the time of John F. Kennedy and the time of Lyndon Johnson, the governor called out the National Guard to stop the violence. The National Guard units who went down to Trinidad were under the command of a man named General John Chase. And he really didn't like immigrants and he didn't like the miners. And he was very much on the side of the company.
Winter came. It was a horrible winter in Colorado. Snowfall. While this was going on, men were thrown in jail, Louis Tekas among them, in the freezing jail in Trinidad. He and other men were in jail for 2 weeks.
Now, what happened was there were many instances of violence between October 1913 and, say, February, March 1914. So many instances of violence that there were congressional hearings. The federal government was holding congressional hearings about violence in southern Colorado. This was front page news in the New York Times. Senators and congressmen were involved in this discussion. The president, Woodrow Wilson, knew everything that was going on in southern Colorado. When the hearings took place, it was decided that the National Guard should be disbanded, but that 2 companies of National Guard would stay in the Ludlow, Trinidad area. These were the people who had kept Mother Jones imprisoned under guard, And one company in particular, Company B, under the command of Karl Linderfelt, a notorious character, is said to have been made up of very tough mercenaries, sometimes men who had fought in the Philippines and had racist feelings. The Philippines War was a little bit like our Vietnam War later. Sometimes people who had fought in Mexico and who really hated immigrants. And Linderfelt hated Louis Ticas. There's a lot of evidence for that. They hated each other. Something bad was bound to happen.
Spring came to Colorado. The Catholics and the Protestants in the camp had their Easter celebration, and the Greeks were determined to have a better celebration. So they planned how they would do it. I asked Gus Papadakis, who was a wonderful old Cretan, a wonderful man, I asked him, did you have a lamb? And he said, yes, we had. I said, how could you afford to have lambs? What money? He said, well, let's put it this way. We procured some lambs. I think Cretans knew everything there was to know about stealing sheep, since they'd been doing it to each other for 1,000 years.
The stories are that some of the Greeks were pretty tough men, you know, that some had fought in the Balkan Wars and all that, right? They'd fought the Turks and they'd fought the Bulgarians, and you know, they knew a thing or two. And the stories are that maybe some of them went out and stole a few sheep, you know, in the countryside and brought them back and cooked the sheep for the resurrection, you know.
They had lambs. They had some treats. They had probably some barrels of beer or wine. They put on their vrakis and they performed dancing, you know, the litters were playing. Oh, the young women just thought they were something else, which led to some friction in the camp between the other miners, their wives, their daughters.
When you see pictures of Louis Ticas, very often he's in his American clothes. He's wearing his wool suit and his puttees. But there are pictures of him as a young man in Crete with his mustache and his Cretan costume, his black boots, you know, and his hat or his scarf, and Mandilia would have been, yeah. I imagine, what if he had those clothes in his trunk in the camp? Would he have put on his Cretan costume and danced, you know, for the Easter in the camp? I'm hoping there was a lira player, you know. Maybe bouzouki, maybe, who knows, lauta. There would have been music. I also think the whole camp was involved, even the non-Orthodox, the Catholics and other people in the camp. They made a big holiday of it on the Sunday of Easter, the Greek Easter. They played baseball in the field near the camp and all of that. They taunted the soldiers who were watching them from the hills. So I think the spirit of Eastern and Western Christianity was alive in the camp. And I think it's a very powerful part of the story that it happened right then. Maybe, in fact, I think I've heard a story about this now that I remember it. I think there's a story about soldiers saying, we'll show them what this death and resurrection thing. We'll show them how to have an Easter. So I think there was a bit of Protestant anger going on at that point too.
Toward the end of that day, some National Guardsmen drunk came in and said, well, you have your fun today, we'll get the roast tomorrow. And whether they knew what was happening and whether it was planned, we don't know. But the next day, Louis Ticas was phoned by the National Guard commander to meet him because a woman claimed that the strikers were holding her husband in camp against his will. Louis was very afraid to go to the National Guard camp. He didn't want to be there by himself. And so he suggested that they meet at a house, a little shack halfway between the strikers' tents and the tents of the National Guard. He went there, and while he was negotiating with Hamrock, there were 1 or 2 bombs that went off. These may have been signals. At any rate, when he looked out the door, he could see the miners from the tents streaming out beyond the tents with guns. My God, what started here? He said to Hamrock, "I will stop them." The miners were leaving because they had seen the National Guard put machine guns in place to cover the tent camp. What were they doing that for? They were terrified that their wives and the kids would be shot. And I believe that they were leaving to try and flank those machine guns, to get them to point away from the tent city. The fighting started, and it lasted all day because Teeka's running with white handkerchiefs couldn't stop it. He spent the day either taking ammunition to the strikers who were in ditches and cuts, firing at the National Guard, and to women that he knew were hiding under the tents. He was with a very courageous woman who had Red Cross training named Pearl Jolly. And they spent all day crawling, making sandwiches, bringing water, crawling under the rifle fire. Okay. Toward dusk, the tents caught on fire. The National Guards claimed a stove must have overturned. The miners claimed that the National Guard set the tents on fire deliberately. Teeka, knowing that there were kids there and women hiding under the tent, went with a white flag to try and get them to stop the firing. He was captured. 2 other miners had been captured with him. A Union treasurer named Filer and an Italian named John Bartolotti.
On the morning of the massacre, it was Linderfeld and Teikas who were at odds together. Teikas, by all reports I have seen, was trying to stop the shooting, trying to keep the peace.
Teikas went with the fire blazing behind him and a white flag, and he was captured. Karl Linderfeld came up to him, broke the stock of his Winchester rifle over the side of Louis' head, and then turned Teikas and the 2 other men over to some National Guardsmen. They knew what to do with him.
Linderfeld allowed him to be executed. He and 2 other men were shot in the back as they were running away and shot on the ground again. So this was not an accidental shooting. This was killing. This was murder, and nobody ever went to prison for it.
They told Teikas and the 2 other men apparently to run, and as they ran toward the tents, they shot all 3 in the back. They lay there for days. The trains coming down from Denver could see these dead men. The camp burned to the ground. And when they could finally get back into it, they found under one of the tents 2 women and 11 children had suffocated. The Union, at their monument at the site of the Ludlow massacre, has that pit where these children and the women died. They've kept it as a kind of shrine to them. The children and the women and other people were buried, and a few days later, April 27, 1914, Louis Teikas was buried in Trinidad, Colorado.
There's a very long street in Trinidad called Commercial, and the photographs show this procession for his funeral from the church all the way out to the Masonic cemetery, which is miles. And man after man after man in these photographs, donned in black suits and black hats, are walking in mile-long processions for Louis Teichas.
Imagine that. The great cultural death and resurrection, the great tragic scene of the Orthodox faith happens in this tragic story of America, a death and resurrection. Louis Teichas is dead and he's alive, right? Zike Vasilevi, in a way, you know, I mean, because we remember him, Echionoma, and we remember his story. So there's a way in which the Paschal story and the political story come together, right? I'm not saying Louis Teichas was Jesus Christ. He was a man, you know, an ordinary man. But the fact that the Easter happened bang, right then, and that the battle happened right after Easter Sunday is a very huge thing.
It seems like Greeks at the time, in particular, other Orthodox folks, would have looked at Louis's murder in a different way. I mean, I think the view of Louis Teichas as a martyr absolutely gained force from this coincidence that this happens, you know, on Greek Easter. So I think the idea of Louis as a martyr and the idea of the 10 Days War as a kind of, you know, in a way, as a sort of, you know, as an uprising of the oppressed. I can imagine that religious belief and religious feeling played a huge role in that.
The miners in Colorado were enraged. They drilled, they got together their guns, they marched, and for 10 days Colorado was in a state of warfare. The coal miners controlled southern Colorado. They wore red neckerchiefs around their necks so that people could know that they were the miners. This lasted for 10 days, shooting, dynamiting, trying to destroy the infrastructure of the mines. They did some horrible things, the miners did in their rampage. They burned down a shack where Japanese scabs were hiding and killed all of them. They burned down a stable and killed the mules. These mules won't scab today, they said.
Αυτό το ανεξέλεγκτο δεν σχετίζεται με ένα πολιτικό σχέδιο το οποίο προκρίνει το ανεξέλεγκτο, σχετίζεται με τις ίδιες τις συνθήκες παραγωγής οι οποίες είναι ανεξέλεγκτες, από την ίδια την αίσθηση ότι εδώ σε αυτόν τον τόπο δεν υπάρχει κανένας νόμος εκτός από τον νόμο της εργοδοσίας και ο μόνος τρόπος να αντιμετωπιστεί ο νόμος της εργοδοσίας είναι η βία ρήξη.
This is a moment of real industrial war. It genuinely is, and in some ways, the wonder is that it wasn't more bloody than it was. People were genuinely enraged when the tents are burned at Ládlow, and then the women and children are found. The women and children of my families are found underneath the tents, who were asphyxiated by they had gone underground to avoid the bullets, and then they're asphyxiated. The outrage, and not just in Colorado, not just in the mining country, the outrage was palpable. It was really very, very deep. And that's one of those moments where you really could feel the possibility of industrial warfare expanding far beyond Colorado. It didn't happen, but you felt like it could have.
The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, of course, controlled everything in southern Colorado. And at the top of this huge complex network that that business had was a transfer of power happening at the same time the strike was called and the massacre occurred. Rockefeller Sr. was passing his business to his son, Rockefeller Jr., and they were very wrapped up in that transfer. And a lot of the information of what was going on in southern Colorado didn't get to Rockefeller Jr.
There are men in Colorado were incredibly biased. One of them in particular, Lamont Montgomery Bowers, was really cut out of the same block that John D. Rockefeller Sr. was. He was a very hard-boiled, unsympathetic man who had absolutely no, he was anti-labor to the core. He believed that unions needed to be crushed. And so the information that the family got from the beginning was very skewed. And John D. Rockefeller Jr. made no attempt really to look beyond, to get any sort of verification of the information he was getting.
When he was aware of everything that happened and after the massacre, Rockefeller Jr. did something very different than his father. He came to southern Colorado. He looked at what happened. He asked why, and he tried to change things over time.
I think one of the important questions is how sincere the change was and how important Ludlow actually was in the change. So in some ways, this is a sort of story that the family tells looking backwards. When you look at Rockefeller, when you look at the Rockefeller family's conduct during the strike, it was objectionable from beginning to end, really, in my view.
The Rockefeller family were distant. They were in New York. John D. Rockefeller Jr. did not come out here to see the scene until after the Ludlow massacre. I have very mixed feelings. I don't, what he did was to let other people do his dirty work for him, and then to pretend that his hands were clean. He wanted to insist in front of Congress that these things had not happened. And the lawyers for the union in front of Congress angrily put the evidence in front of him and said, look at this, look at these photographs, look at these dead children, look at these dead bodies. And Rockefeller was apparently shocked by these things. But, who's responsible? He hired the men who did this. What is his role in this?
I don't think there's any way whatsoever that the Rockefeller family, ordered a hit on Louis Tekas. It's more possible that the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company executives in Colorado might have done such a thing.
In my opinion, Lieutenant Linderfelt killed Teichus in cold blood. I don't necessarily think it was any kind of order from superiors. I feel like it was a rash decision in that moment. And to support that, you have the trial that happened afterwards. Linderfelt was accused of manslaughter of Louis Teichus, and his own men testified against him. Now, if it was a plan, if it was an order, they wouldn't have done that. He would have just been following what was expected of him as the lieutenant. But the fact that they'd had this disagreement over the months leading up to it, I feel like it definitely became the villain versus the hero. And the hero lost in that instance and became the martyr, even though Linderfelt did get found guilty of manslaughter and he was kicked out of the militia.
In a lot of ways, I think things would have gone better if John D. Rockefeller Jr. had come out to Colorado earlier, and if he had taken a more personal role in the strike at an earlier point. He seemed to be a reasonable person, more or less good human being.
In a way, he was an ideologue. And it reminds me of the right wing in America now. They think they are being virtuous. They think they are doing good for America by proposing their ideas about what makes a strong economy and what makes a good life. But they are not paying attention to the real lives of people, the actual lives of poor people and workers and all that sort of thing. People who work in factories or mines or businesses like Walmart do not work in a system of ideas. They work day to day to get their money and food in the conditions they work in, and the conditions are not ideal. These ideologues, these intellectuals who say, you should have the right to work, you should have the right not to organize as a union, that's a statement of principle. It's all very nice. It's very nice. But it doesn't have to do with the actual lives of the people who need help getting their lives improved.
This was a horrible defeat, ultimately, for the labor movement in Colorado. And the coalfield strike in 1913-14 played an important role in turning many middle-class and upper-class Coloradans against the labor movement, and actually against people of color and against immigration. So by the 1920s, I think the legacy of Ludlow for Colorado at that point in time is really, Colorado was ruled by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. And I think Ludlow's an important part of understanding why. The other side of that, though, is that by the 1930s, Ludlow was one of a string of events that really convinced a lot of liberals in the United States that workers deserved fuller federal protection. And so Ludlow, I think, contributed to the passage of the Wagner Act, which has created the kind of modern framework for unionization in the United States. So in Southern Colorado, one of the legacies of that is that Southern Colorado coal mine workers would unionize under the United Mine Workers successfully in the 1930s for the very first time.
In autos and steel and rubber and the basic industries, and then finally, to a certain extent, in clerical work, not just in blue-collar work, but also in white-collar work, America becomes a union country for a while, and it means that workers are much, much better off, have much more job security, better wages, more say on the job. If the question is, do you win or lose that particular strike, the union lost. Mother Jones lost. But again, memory is important, and life is long, and history is long. The United Mine Workers doesn't go out of business. It continues to organize with some success, and finally with great success.
Οι 10 μέρες του βιομηχανικού πολέμου στο Κολοράντο είναι από εκείνες οριακές στιγμές όπου κάτι που φαινομενικά φαίνεται απλό, μια εργατική διαμαρτυρία στη μέση του πουθενά, μετασχηματίζεται σε μια δυνάμει επαναστατική κατάσταση. Δυνάμει επαναστατική κατάσταση όχι γιατί όλοι όσοι συμμετέχουν έχουν ένα συγκεκριμένο σχέδιο για την επόμενη μέρα, αλλά γιατί είναι εκείνοι οι λεπτές στιγμές που οι υλικές ανάγκες συναντούν, μετασχηματίζονται σε μια ευρύτερη διεκδίκηση.
Ludlow has two sides for me. The side I know from family experience, cherishing it from a young age, understanding the meaning on the individual people and descendants. Then it has what's been preserved in books and in history. And it's very different. And sometimes I feel like I'm very protective of the real story, which I think I know because of my family connection. So when I read a book or a newspaper article or see a documentary that has just some little thing that's slightly different than what I know, I'm very protective and think, well, there's a way that this should be presented more accurately. There's more to this story. It's not just a list of events and this tragic massacre, and then that's all. There's so much more to it.
Well, what does it mean to be an American? America is an experiment in personhood, in asking a question every election over and over again. What is a human being? What is a human being? Who has a right to vote? Who has a right to be here? Who has a right to marry? Who has a right to drive a car? Who has a right to fight in the army? Who has a right to education? Every election we are fighting about the same things that they were fighting about at the time of Ludlow. So by telling this story, set in 1913, 1914, with a little bit after and a little bit before, I can really talk about what it means to be a human being and what it means to feel that you maybe don't have a right to exist in this world, and that you need to discover your own right to exist in this world, your own right to just be here, and the way many people in this country tell you you don't have a right to exist, you don't have a right to be, and the way Americans have had to refight that war over and over and over again. So Ludlow is a perennial story in this country, and as I wrote the story, I realized that I was not just writing about a strike and a war. I was writing about storytelling itself, and how when we tell stories, we discover where we are in the world. We locate ourselves in the world.
I believe that the people who do have connections, whether because they live in southern Colorado now in the old mining communities, or because perhaps they had relatives who lived there, I think that there is a sense of connectedness among them, connected with each other, and also connected with the previous generations.
My dad told me once, when he was maybe 10 years old, that he wanted to go hunting. They were raised very, very outdoorsy, and my Uncle Joe had a rifle to go hunting, and my father didn't. And he was lamenting and kind of upset, and his grandfather was living with him at the time, and he went to his grandfather and said, "I can't go hunting, I have nothing to shoot anything with." And I guess my great-grandfather went into his bedroom, came back with this .30-30 Winchester rifle, and he handed it to my dad and said something to the effect, "You can take this and go hunting, and you can use this, and now this belongs to you, but don't ever get rid of it, and don't ever sell it. This is the rifle that I used at Ludlow." And that story to my family gives us a direct connection, and it just shows with a few little words everything that my great-grandfather had gone through, and that connection that my father had from that one incident brought him so much closer to his grandfather and to this event in history. And that's one of the stories that I will always treasure, and that rifle is now a prized family heirloom in my family that we will never get rid of. My father wants to be buried with the rifle, so it always stays with him, and he always has that connection to his grandfather.
The way I found out about Louis Tίκas was that I was using an internet search engine looking for something else, something to do with children and mountains in Colorado. This was about 2001, and I searched for Colorado children, I think mountains, I forgot what else I was searching for, and one of the things that came up were that 24 women and children died and during the strike, and Louis Tίκas was a leader. Well, I knew that my grandfather had been involved in the strike, and that when my grandmother was going into labor, Walsenburg was unsafe, and she had to walk from Walsenburg all the way to Trinidad. And when she got to Trinidad, she gave birth to her second child, my father. And he was named Lewis. I had asked my father before he died why they named him Lewis, because I didn't know that we had a relative, Lewis. And he said he was named after a friend of his father who had died during the strike. And now, reading the result of my search, the light came on, and I said, my father was named after this guy. And I started reading about Louis Tekas, and that would make sense. He was a labor leader, a union organizer. And my father had told me that his father knew this Louis, and Louis was his best friend. And Louis was the guy you go to who would always help everybody.
He has the Pαλληκάρι, the Levendis aspect to him, but he's also a very sensitive man. And maybe Louis was a little bit tougher than that, as some people say. But I fell in love with the problem he had. He had to try to make himself belong here. And his role in the strike was his effort to assert his right to be here. They made him a leader in the camp, but it was a problematic situation for him. And he became an American citizen early in 1914, and 4 months later, Americans shot him in the back, executed him. What does that mean about my country? That we kill our own people like that, that we execute our own people. After all, he was only trying to keep the peace. He was only trying to help.
After I had read about Louis Tekas and learned how he lived and how he died, I decided that I would visit his grave in Trinidad. I found his grave and I said, I really need to get some flowers. I drove into Trinidad, bought some flowers, and I found a liquor store. I bought some alcoholic adult beverage from Greece, and I said, I want to give this to Louis to thank him. So I went back to the cemetery and I poured some on his grave and talked to him. And I noticed around his grave, the other graves had markers that were not in English. Some of them were Oriental, probably Japanese. Some were apparently Ukrainian. When I realized that they had been buried in 1914 or 1915, around the same time as Louis, so these were probably immigrant coal miners. And if Louis were here today, I know he would say to me, give them some wine too. Share this, everybody gets a little sip. And I made sure that every grave around his got a little sip. And when I go back to his grave to this day, I visit 2 or 3 times a year. I make sure that every grave around his, that could be a coal miner's, gets a little sip of some Greek wine.
Where he is buried now, he's got a very simple headstone. It's flush with the ground. It's very simple and it's very beautiful. And every time I've been there, I've seen more often than not a red bandana somewhere near his headstone. Sometimes I've seen one kind of tied in a bow laying on his headstone. Sometimes I've seen one in a small tree that's close to his grave. And it warms my heart because it's 100 years later and somebody understands the significance of the red bandana, the miner's uniform, they called it. Someone else understands the significance of Teikas. Even in death, his legacy continues to be acknowledged and appreciated. And it's beautiful to see that recognition, and that even if it's just one person, they understand what all of that means.
Guns and lives were cheap in Colorado. Coal was king in 1910. And in the deepest coal mine's darkest shadow, there was no justice for the working men. Every day brought cave-ins and explosions because the safety laws were not applied. For profit mattered more than the lives of all the poor. And every day another miner died. And the coal was black, and the blood was red, and miners that dared organize always wound up dead. And in those days of anger, a man of peace arose. Words were the weapons that Lewis Teeka chose. In Walsenburg, in Ludlow, and in Sopris, and 30 other towns they joined the cause. Lewis brought them hope when all was hopeless, and he said the owner must obey the laws. The miners went on strike in 1913, and shootings left both guards and workers dead. And Lewis' voice was heard, he told both sides these words: lay down the guns and talk instead. The snow was white, his blood was red, but the miners and their wives and their little children bled. And the owner took their homes, and they lived in tents in rows. And words were the weapons that Lewis Teeka chose. And when he passed, and still the mines were striking, and the shooting and the killing had not ceased. Lewis couldn't stop them all from fighting, so the National Guard was called to keep the peace. When the Guard arrived with their machine guns, they cracked a rifle over Lewis' head, and they shot him till he died, and they still weren't satisfied till they filled his lifeless body up with lead. The sky was blue, and the blood was red, and the National Guard left Lewis and 24 others dead. Now he's on a hillside where the purgatory flows, and words were the weapons, words were the weapons, words were the weapons that Lewis Teeka chose. Mourn with me, my sisters and my brothers, for a leader lying silent in the grave. Lewis spent his whole life saving others, and in the end his life is what he gave. Lewis spent his whole life saving others, and in the end his life is what he gave.